Well, good morning and welcome as we continue to seek hearing God and how He may be speaking to us, particularly through the series that we've taken up at the beginning of this summer entitled The Deconstruction Zone, where we are engaging the cultural ideas that can be challenging for people to navigate in terms of their beliefs. And our intent through these weeks has not been to raise questions presuming that we could bring that which entirely satisfies or settles those issues, but to provide that which gives some ideas about how to navigate those, provide some kind of initial thinking about what God might say into the kind of questions that so many people might struggle with today. And that's especially true today as we engage this question: is Christianity homophobic? Is Christianity homophobic? Now, I'll unpack the wider sense of what I'm referring to in the brevity of that question. But I'm well aware that there's a sense for many of us like, oh no, we really can't engage this issue. This has just become so divided, so loaded within our current culture. And I know that we're living in kind of the time of cultural wars where everything regarding sexuality can be that which is drawing us perhaps to different deep feelings. For some, it can draw us into the idea that we really need to be drawn to stand up against those who are marginalized and oppressed. And for others, that we need to be those drawn into standing up against an ideologies that are devolving our sense of meaning and morals. And my guess is that, right here among those that are being engaged here or online, that probably 30% might fall on one of those sides and be drawn to one of those sides. And about 30% to the other. About 30% feel like they're kind of divided, drawn into tensions between the two. The other 10% are still waiting to get an internet connection and don't have internet or cable or phone and don't get out much. The reality is that I think a lot of us live with a sense of fear that this is just about something that is dividing us, or even a division within us, where we just feel this tension about, I don't know how, I never feel it's simple or settled, because it's not. It's not simple. There's nothing simple about sexuality. But why then would we dare to come and engage such a question? Because for one, in this series, in the context of this series, this is at the forefront for many people of the idea and culture that they're trying to wrestle with. I don't want to be associated with fear and hate. And so it's very hard to reconcile my Christian beliefs if they in some way are associated with that. And that's such a legitimate question. But even more in this context, I think it's so significant because there are so many people who have themselves experienced attractions to their same gender, conflicts within their own sense of identity, and they have not found a safe space within their own churches to be able to process those things. There are far too many people who have said that they haven't even found kindness in the context of their own feelings. And so for those reasons, I think it's so vital that we engage these. And so I want to say, knowing that there is so many sensitive dynamics, so many challenging things, and realizing that the whole of sexuality is just so wide and so deep and is worthy of so much thought, that I want to say two things up front that I think are vital for you and I. The first is this: that we don't have to agree, but let's grow together in engaging the heart and mind of God for human life. We have to realize that in the midst of all that is so challenging, it's also very evolving. I know for the past 20, 25 years, it has been a deep part of my own personal drive, if you will, even to engage the issues of sexuality and sexual ethics. And so I have found myself constantly in a cycle of engaging deeply in biblical studies and reflection, personal conversations, cultural ideas. And in that process, I find myself always thinking afresh and trying to press in deeply. And if there's anything I've realized, that there's a part of me at one level that's always in process, that realizes that at one level, my call is to be faithful, not certain. And faithfulness is different than certainty. Faithfulness means that I have to embrace my best understanding of God's desire for human good, while I continually seek to understand God's desire for human good. And I hope at some level that that's a process that we're all in, because I know that if we engage any question, and today we're only looking at one tiny portion of the questions that can emerge, that there is so many things that are worthy and need to be engaged. There's a lot of things that perhaps might rise in you, and but what about? There's so many, but what about? I'm glad if you have those. And I'd love to have time to be able to begin to just have conversation and discussion about those things. So today we're also creating a time after this gathering where we'll have a little bit of time to be able to discuss some of those but what abouts. We'll do it straight down that hallway just shortly after our gathering. Hope you'll join me. I want to encourage you, take up those questions, engage them more deeply, listen to one another. But I want to say too that I've got a lot of resources that I'll just pack in. If you're really interested, there'll just be tons because we can't begin to engage those things. But I hope that you'll take advantage first of the opportunity for a little face-to-face time. The second thing that I want to note is this, that we should never forget that engaging sexuality is never just an ethical issue, but about what real people are navigating. One of the things that I've been aware of and just watching how this issue or any issues of sexuality are engaged is that there's going to be those who feel a deeper loyalty to truth and really looking for the truth of God and how to bring that about and disagree. And there's those who have a loyalty to people and they're more drawn into kind of compassion. And I want to say that in Jesus, both of these things must come together. But we must never think of things as merely an issue out there that is not relating to somebody's real experience and conflicts. We must always have that in our hearts. Somebody once said, sometimes how we believe is just as important as what we believe. I think there's a lot of truth in that. How we believe is as important as what we believe. So today we're engaging just one question, which is Christianity homophobic? And in the most narrow and literal sense of that, it really would say phobia, meaning fear, really refers to the idea is there something inherent in Christian beliefs that brings forth a fear of those who have same-sex attraction, in its most literal sense. But the larger question, and I think what it really ultimately is reflecting that kind of a question, and it's often said that way, is there something inherent in Christian beliefs that brings forth fear, but also with that fear brings forth hate? Is there a hate towards a particular group of people? Now, in terms of the historic Christian understanding for really the whole of 2,000 years until very recently, it has been the Christian position that God has created us deeply complementary beings, created us male and female to unite physically as such, and there's much more that could be said about all of that. But in that position, then the challenge is, well, if God's created us in that complementary nature, how are we to relate when people don't experience that kind of a natural attraction? Or what about their own identities as being male and female? All those things arise. And in those 2,000 years, it has always been a fairly consistent ethic that draws us back to that central creation as God's design and desire. However, it's also never been a central issue in terms of how to engage those who don't experience that. So for all of the millennia, it's been fairly limited as a central issue, but now kind of emerging. And the challenge, we won't even begin to take up that position, but I'd be glad to afterwards and unpack so much more of how I think we need to think about that position. But the issue today is more about posture. Is there an inherent fear or hatred that's there? And I think to engage that question, I want to begin by sharing a little bit of my own journey. I was born and raised in this area, and so I grew up at a local beach here in which everybody came to surf, to play beach volleyball, to hang out. And in the 1970s, the later part of the 1970s, I began working at a beach club, a private beach club, as a beach boy, if you can believe it, and right next door to that, adjoining that beach. And in fact, 40 years after that time, they just had a centennial of this private beach club, and they decided to take those notorious beach boys across these few years, and they had a reunion where they brought us all, and it was this craziest thing because we basically dominated the club and had this amazing life going on, and now they were honoring us. It was the strangest thing. This was about 3 weeks ago. And I'd love to show you those pictures, but I won't dare do it. You know, from 40 years ago and this group of beach boys to today, it was pretty funny to see each other after 40 years. But in that context, right in between the two was what was emerging as really a world-renowned kind of gay beach. And world-renowned meaning in the underground of the gay community, it was known. It was the only beach like it in Los Angeles. And it was at a time in which the feelings towards any kind of overt gay expression was deeply uncomfortable. There was like an animosity kind of under the surface. Not really a hatred, but you could just feel like all the comments and such spoke for themselves. And so it is that we had clashes from time to time as we would be in between these two beaches and living in this way. And right across the way, there was what had become one of the most renowned gay bars. And that bar was kind of becoming more infamous and kind of an ire to those who just were in this clash of cultures, if you will. So one night, leaving that beach and running off from work with the cohort after drinking quite a bit, the car just pulled over, and I jumped out of the car, took a lit smoke bomb, kicked the door open, and threw that lit smoke bomb into that bar. Drove off. Never to think of it again. Never imagined thinking of it again. Probably didn't think of it 10 minutes later. Till 15 years later. Because through those years, I'd begun to recommit my life to following the way of Jesus. I had gone and during college years began to start a community of people, and we just began to welcome people who were in deep need to come and stay with us. And that included a lot of people who were experiencing a lot of conflicts, including sexuality. Then was abroad for a couple of years, came back and became a part of the Vineyard. And it was in this context and through a ministry that was welcoming people to engage issues of sexuality that now some of my closest emerging friends were those who were dealing with their own same-sex attractions, their own struggle with sexual addictions. And it was transforming for me because growing up in that era that I did, I saw this separation. Now I was finding myself joining in the struggle. What does it mean to be a man or a woman? What does it mean to live in the full nature of what God has, and facing the depth of my own sense of brokenness, my own sense of coming before God and realizing how much kind of healing and what he had for me. And so it's in that process that I found myself deeply having a moment where the Holy Spirit just brought to my attention what I had done 15 years earlier. So one Friday night after a meeting, I felt led that I needed to go back to that bar, that I needed to ask for forgiveness. And I didn't tell anybody, and I drove down to that spot across the street, And it was one of the most awkward moments as I'm sitting in the car going, this is just so awkward. But more importantly, it's 15 years later. I mean, there's no chance that anybody's going to be related to what I did 15 years later, so how do I do that? Well, I walked into that bar, into that dark bar, and I asked if there was somebody who was a manager, found them, and I started to tell a little bit of stories. Is there anybody here that would in any way have still been connected 15 years ago? And they said, actually, yes. 15 years ago is when that owner bought this property. They also run the restaurant that's neighboring, and they're there right now. And I was stunned. It was 11 o'clock on a Friday night, and the same person who was there 15 years earlier was there. So I went to them, shared the story. I said, probably you've never heard this before. And I asked their forgiveness. And they said, no one's ever, that's a first, no one's ever come. And we take a lot of animosity. And they were incredibly gracious, forgiving. Said, come, bring your family. And it was the beginning of realizing how much there was a need for me to deal with my own fears, my own prejudice. And I want to say that it's in that context that we need to face the reality that I was facing, which is something that didn't come particularly from Christian culture, by the way. It really is just a part of our whole culture. It's a part of our whole humanity. And it's this, that we tend to have fear and ultimately reject what we have to face in ourselves, even if it's just in parallel ways. And by that I mean it doesn't have to be that we share the same exact issues, but some form of our own brokenness. Our sexuality has always been a source of inner conflict and discomfort, far more than we want to talk about. We all want to feel like we've got to express that we're boldly comfortable as a man or woman, but the truth is, we have been in conflict since the day we were born. There is something that is just we struggle with comparison as we go through kind of the middle years of childhood, and we're just trying to figure out, what is it? Do I really compare? Am I really a guy or a woman? I mean, I don't know how to feel that. Or that we find ourselves feeling so consumed with sexual desires and so controlled by them, we're not comfortable. And so what do we do when we're not comfortable with something within ourselves? Well, we tend to look for that which we can say, well, that I can kind of condemn as a scapegoat. That's been a natural part of humanity. It's not simply a part of Christian culture or inherent to Christian culture, but religious culture will struggle more deeply, perhaps, with that dynamic. Why? Because in religious culture, there is a real calling to be a good person, to be more right. And when you feel there's a need to be more right, you don't know what to do with the part of you that's not right. And it's going to accentuate that. And as a result of that, that dynamic can play out. And the reality of that is that we have to face the fact that in Christianity, which reflects Christian cultures, there has been a deep sense of those very dynamics. Or to say it this way, Christianity always refers only to a variety of cultural and human forms that claim to reflect Christ. And in this sense, Christianity is strewn with elements of homophobia, of fear and aversion, not because of the actual life and teachings of Christ, but in spite of them. And so I had to face that running not only through Christian culture, but running through myself, running through humanity, but yes, running through Christian culture, and at times in ways that are tragic, in ways in which people have been incredibly demeaned or worse. And to anyone who has experienced that as they're trying to navigate their own internal sexuality, I'm not sure I can really say sorry on behalf of the sources of that hurt, but I am really sorry for what you have had to experience. And what I want to invite us to is the more significant question. Not merely has there been associations with this thing called Christianity, but the question of how does Jesus engage this type of fear and hate? If Jesus is one who does share, perhaps, in that view of God's design and desire as being meant for complementary, how does he engage with anything that is in tension with that? And so I want to invite you to a passage that many are familiar with. It's an encounter that really reflects the very thing that I'm describing about the way that we tend to reject, scapegoat, the very fears and conflicts that are within ourselves. It's found in John's Gospel in the New Testament, chapter 8. You can follow with me in verses 2 through 11. We read this encounter. It says, at dawn, he, Jesus, appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. Now, what do you say? They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, let any one of you who's without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. Then again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first. Interesting line. I think life has a way of sobering us until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Go now and leave your life of sin. Here we see someone's violation of sexual behavior. And we may disagree on whether there can be correlation, but we could say that it still is very insightful to how Jesus might deal with any of us if we were to have these things brought forward, have our own sexual brokenness brought forward. And the first thing that we see is that Jesus restores the common ground as he confronts the projecting of common shame. Jesus sees that as those stones are raised and they're going to be projected, that they weren't merely projecting their stones, but they were projecting their own shame. And what they had done is merely been able to create this great separation where they place the woman as the target and they place all the focus upon her. And it's at this point that we see that Jesus is calling them to do what? To look at their own brokenness. Anyone who wants to claim that they are not on common ground is welcome to throw a stone. But with that, we see them drop their stones and the scene begins to change. And what we see here is how deeply our own process is always the way of the world. We always give in to the way of the world, which is what? To separate people between being bad or good so that we end up on the good side. That's what we do. That's our inclination. But Jesus never enters this world to do that. He always defies that tendency. And he sees us on common ground. And he comes to meet us on that common ground. And he challenges it every turn. We find in the Gospel of Mark another story where it says Levi, the tax collector, he had just called. And that, again, was going to infuriate people. Tax collectors were like the worst. They were deemed to be the enemies of God. But this Levi, this tax collector, invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests, and along with many tax collectors and other disreputable sinners. And it says there were many people of this kind among Jesus' followers. But when the teachers of the religious law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with tax collectors and other sinners, they asked his disciples, why does he eat with such scum? English translation. When Jesus heard this, he told them, healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do. I've come to call not those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners. He couldn't be more clear. He's come to call everyone, but only those who can identify as sick. It's not a compliment, what he's saying. He's basically saying, what? We're all sick. And it's for us to realize that and to meet him in that space. And what we find is Jesus isn't there to affirm anything. He's there with compassion to meet her, but all in that state. Secondly, what we see is, along with Jesus restoring that common ground, Jesus creates a safe space as he stands with the one in the place of shame without condemnation. You note what the people had done is what? Create separation. We're going to stand away from her. Almost like one who has an interrogator's light and you shine it so bright in the face of the other person, but when you stand behind the light, what? No one can see you. So they created a safe space for themselves, but Jesus changes everything. Where does he stand? He stands with her. He stands in the vulnerable place in which all the shame is being projected, because that's where Jesus stands. He stands with us in our shame. With all the accusations, what does he do? He silences the voices and the violence of the crowds. And we need to know that's where Jesus wants to stand with us in all of the things that might condemn us. He stands against those voices. He stands against the violence and all that might come against us. And there he is with her. And in the end, the scene changes to where it is only Jesus that she is with. He alone is in the position to be with her. And how powerful it is. And to that we might say, well, he's there because he's on her side of an issue? Hardly. Jesus, in the end, tells her, go and leave your life of sin. It's not that he's in agreement. It's that he stands to bring and bear grace, which leads thirdly to this, that Jesus calls for leaving the self-defined life to restore one's God-given identity. When he says those words to her, go and leave your life of sin, I've always wondered what she must have thought. We don't know. She, I think, must have wondered, like, I don't know if he really knows me. Like, this has been my whole life. These people are kind of right. Is he ignorant of the life that I lead and what my patterns have been? She might have thought that. She might have wondered, is it even really possible? I've never found it to be possible it's just too late. But I have a sense that he may have had the ability to give her a profound change because he bore the authority of heaven's love. So powerfully did she sense what he was speaking into her life, that perhaps it opened a space that she had never imagined. A different way of seeing herself, a different invitation than she'd ever known. But the point in what we need to realize is this: what seems clear is that Jesus neither condemns her nor does he condone her way of life. And that is what should be so striking, is what Jesus brings us to is that which creates space to stand against hate. And that's what clearly he does. While at the same time he stands for that which is different than what she'd ever known. Something deeper, something more profound. He neither operates out of this place of kind of condemnation or this place of kind of condoning, but this place of compassion. Or to put it this way, Jesus creates space where truth and compassion meet. Jesus creates space where truth and compassion meet, or as someone described it, understanding that Jesus represents an inclusive love and an exclusive truth. There are things that are true, and he brings them to bear, and they're greater than anything that we can easily sometimes even initially grasp, but he challenges us with a larger reality about who we are and how to live into that, what the Father's house is about, and how to live in the Father's house again. But he does so reaching to all people into that scope. And I believe this challenges, and what I want to bring forth is that it challenges the way that our culture separates these two, particularly in kind of the politics of sexuality. In the politics of sexuality, if we can use that term right, it is pressing in kind of a cultural war to find oneself feeling really good about being drawn into either of two narratives. One narrative is that there must be this battle against those that are so hateful and standing to oppress a marginalized group, and doing so in such a way that it reflects those who stood against stood for slavery and supported slavery in the past, and we must not find ourselves on the wrong side of the civil rights issue of our day. And so therefore there is merely that which deems people to be hateful in the same way and brings all of that to bear. And if that is the only cause and that is the only way to see things, then one is fighting very hateful people. The other is seeing it as we must fight an ideology that is seeking to, completely eradicate the family and all things that are good and moral, and we must fight such hate because they are haters of God, and these are the haters of gays. And it's like this hate. But here's what I find so insidious about that, is that it has to jump to presume that the only motivation anybody could have for any belief is hate. That, I think, is not only false, but deeply dangerous. It is what ends up working its way into the deepest division of families and friends and community, when it presumes that everything is rooted in hate. The truth is, as I engage people throughout all these years, I don't find that those who share same-sex attraction, and I believe that that's what God's will, are those who stand up and affirm that to them, that they are haters of God. Many of them love God. And I don't find that those who don't affirm all things in terms of being normative in sexuality are those who are hateful of other people. The truth is, when we carry out that assumption upon people, we end up feeling really good about ourselves because we're on the right side of hate. But we just absolutely end up separating ourselves from people in ways that are profound. The truth is, when we kind of send out on social media our judgment of everybody else who's on the other side of an issue, we might feel heroic, but what we've done is we've just told people exactly how we will treat them if they disagree with us. We do it all the time. And the truth is, we've got to realize that there is such a difference in human relationship between when people can say, we disagree, and I think you're wrong, versus when we say, you're hateful. You're a horrible person. Do you understand the difference between those two? And we treat it so lightly. We treat it so lightly. Let me note and ask this question. How much larger would our sphere of friends be if we didn't have to agree in order to love one another? Ask yourself that. Because we are following a way of thinking that to love one another, we have to agree. That's the assumption that's underlying it. Or how much stronger would our family ties be if we didn't have to affirm every belief and choice that another makes? The truth is, most of us realize that the idea that we have to agree in order to love, or that love is inherently demands agreement about things, we can't disagree, is a very cheap version of love. It's a very cheap idea of love. It's very shallow to think that one has to agree in order to do that. And so what I want to challenge us with, and what I want us to take hold of, is this, that love is not defined by agreement and affirmation of all beliefs and choices, but how we join others on the common ground of our need. and support that which reflects our best understanding of that which honors God's desire for human good. We may disagree about what honors or what reflects God's desire or how to walk that out. We may disagree with that, but we need to be able to understand that what we're called to is to love, and we have to do that out of the place in which we understand our best understanding of what God would have for someone and the many ways that we walk that out. And so to the question, does Christian faith bear an inherent fear and hate of a group or groups of people based on sexual orientation or gender identity? I believe deeply and definitively the answer to that is no. It's not inherent to that. There are many things that might be challenging, and out of my own position, I find myself only more challenged to think through how to live out that which is loving and compassionate and real for how people will have to navigate, any of us, our sexuality, but particularly those. And distinctly, I might add, those who, not by choice, but by their own nature, find themselves given to attractions they didn't choose, or tensions with their own and conflicts with their own identity. But as to whether it is inherently hateful, that is what I would challenge is not. And I would encourage us and challenge us to realize that I think a large part of what Jesus has that is important for us to open ourselves up to is the space that Jesus is creating. It's larger, it's deeper, it's more dynamic than merely this idea that the space we live in is that in which we're told that we're everything is fine about us, or everything is wrong and we're condemned. He creates a very different space, and we have to find our way into that space. And I believe that his challenge to us is to realize that we have a different story about what it even really means to be human, about what it really even means to belong, about what it really even means to fit. And we need to challenge ourselves to realize it's very different. And that in some ways, even our communal identity, our communal qualities, our communal life must be challenged by those things. And so I want to invite us, and I want to close with just quickly noting, as I look deeply into the reality of our own sexuality, I see that Jesus is challenging us in a lot of core levels. But in terms of even some of our community qualities, I believe we do well to recognize this, that one, Jesus creates a space for our common brokenness, for gathering together in our various conflicts and confusion related to our sexuality. What I found is Jesus isn't so much just here to divide and separate into categories, but actually recognizing there are distinctions of those categories, but we're not entirely defined merely by our sexuality, but by something so much more, and that we're all in much greater conflict, and he comes to meet us in that, and to call us to be people who realize that kind of common ground. Much more could be said, but secondly, I think Jesus creates a space for greater freedom in how we experience and express our biological gender. And by that, again, we could unpack this at great length, and I'd be glad to, and there's tons here in these notes, but I just want to say that I think one of the challenges we have is that we are always living. We're always raised with these cultural ideas and ideals that leave us in a great sense of conflict and comparison. And we're kind of like, I don't know how I fit. And a lot of times the church can even perpetuate kind of narrow ideas of what a man or what a woman is about. And the reality is that Jesus, while embodied in a way that I think affirms his own biological nature, is also one who defies, in so many regards, all the cultural ideas associated with gender. It's actually part of much of the Hebrew culture that wouldn't even share American culture's ideas, but besides just the fact that we see a whole lot more diversity and expressions and how we fit as men and women, Jesus defies them in whole new ways. Jesus is one who has the courage to turn a table and to face the fact that violence might come against him. But also Jesus is the one who is willing to let people beat on him, to mock him. Jesus is willing to suffer for the sake of others. Jesus is one who speaks with great authority, but never dominated or controlled anyone. You can't look at Jesus and say that he carries on the usual nature of patriarchy and dominance. He defies it. And I think he, in many regards, he would challenge us to create a lot more space for what people find in them and their experience as being a man or woman. And he would challenge us to create a community with that kind of space. And again, we could go off in great length. And thirdly, though, the final challenge is this, that Jesus creates a space for deeper belonging. At some level, the question we're ultimately asking is, do I fit? Do I belong? Is there a place for me? And I think that Jesus challenges the whole idea. So much of our idea of belonging is defined by just merely belonging to our nuclear human family or a particular community. Jesus challenges it all. Jesus was never married. Jesus didn't define himself by finding out how his sexual activity lived out. Jesus, in so many ways, realized and invited us to realize we belong because God said, "You're my daughter or son." That's it. You belong because of your deep calling by God. He is the source of our existence, and he's the end of our existence. And belonging must find its way into that. And so it is that my sense of belonging is challenged far more deeply than I think we're willing to think sometimes. My fit, my belonging is not defined by my self-righteousness, like the group who tried to fit and belong as they were going to project stones. It's not there because I'm good enough, right enough, fixed enough. But neither do I belong because of my own self-affirmations and my own self-perceptions and my own kind of inner identifying. I don't find myself there either. I find myself by hearing the love of God for me, and that's it. And I don't know about you, but what I find is that when I sit in the presence of God, there I meet Jesus. And I meet with Jesus one whose love was not conditional. It was foundational. He's there with love, not waiting for me. He's there. And what I find in the presence is I sit and I just allow myself to experience God's presence, is that it's not so much about affirming everything in me. It's not like, hey, God, are you, you're pretty big on who I am. It's more like I feel like an affirmation that transcends my experience. And I believe that's the place he's inviting us, to that which transcends who we are right now, but is inviting us to so much more that we haven't even begun to grasp. Would you pray with me? God, we come as those who know that there has got to be more common ground. We've got to realize that we are so divided, and in some ways we each have to struggle with our own self-righteousness. We're uncomfortable with things, and we try to find comfort in being distinctly good, smart, right. That is not where we're going to find our belonging. We pray that you would help us to find it in the face of your grace. We pray that where we have presumed hate upon all who disagree, that we might find more space, God, for us to learn how we can disagree, but grow together in understanding and continually understanding your design and desire for human good. Pray that you'd open our minds and our hearts to your mind and heart, that we might continue to discern your mind and heart, both as men and women, as sexual beings, but also for the sake of others. We pray that you might invite us from that place of judgment and that place of cheap love to that place of deep compassion. Jesus, that we might be those who create space in the way that you did. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's stand and turn our hearts in worship.
Let me be filled